Adam, do you ever wish these kids will just get off your damn lawn?
Okay, let me tell you something about lawns, Sam, and why they're the biggest scam this side of the 21st century, and indeed before. First of all, lawns are incredibly environmentally unsustainable. Not only that, but they get rid of I get blisters on my hands from mowing the lawn all the time, and in conclusion, I hope to never own a lawn in my goddamn life.
Thank you for that 10-minute explanation on lawns, Adam. And hello, and welcome to Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast where we explore protests and revolution, past and present, and try to make sense of it all. Joining me, as always, speaking of lawns, is a man so European that he once got completely lost in an American suburb. Adam, how are you today?
I'm good. That was truly unsettling because I walked down a street that I was convinced was your street because every house was different from every other house, but was a carbon copy of the street you actually lived in. Wild stuff. Anyway, I'm fine. I haven't seen the sun in about 2 weeks because it's January in Amsterdam. But other than that, doing well. How are you, Sam? It's a big day today.
As we speak, Orange Hitler is being inaugurated. Did you see his official photo that he took for this presidency?
I did not.
He's leaning into the villain card. He did the exact same pose that he did for his mugshot, and the lighting is from underneath. So,
oh god.
Yeah, if that's not a sign of things to come, what is?
Day one, he's going to be a dictator.
Well, hopefully, as we said last time, people will listen back to this in a few years' time and say we overblew the whole thing. Hopefully. Not counting on it. Nonetheless, Adam, it's good to have you here, and it's even better to have you, dear listener. If you made it this far, then we are extremely grateful that you are enjoying this enough to go into your 4th hour of us in your ear. Last episode, Adam walked us through the anatomy of a protest and gave a lot of different examples of how one can show their discontent. Some of these were indirect and symbolic, like artistic movements and solidarity campaigns, but many were more direct forms of action. And today we'll be talking about a group that often plays a big role in these direct actions. But before we get started, I have an Independence Day of the week to share with you. And I'm sorry, Adam, I had to steal this one from next week because, as you said last episode, there are really not a lot at the end of January. So I will be highlighting Nauru, which was January 31st, 1968. Don't worry, Adam, there are plenty to choose from in early February.
Glad to hear it.
Nauru is an island nation in the South Pacific. This was an interesting Independence Day to research because they declared independence from the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, who had a joint administration over the island and basically had turned the whole place into a giant phosphate mine. Really grim stuff. And in 1964, Australia actually proposed the idea of moving the whole population of the island to a new settlement in northern Queensland in Australia and making the whole population Australian citizens, since Nauru was deemed, quote, financially impossible to rehabilitate the environment of. But the people fought back against this. They opted for independence. They opted to rebuild, essentially, and clean up the place. And they achieved their independence in 1968 and are still going relatively strong.
Congratulations to our comrades in Nauru. I have heard about the phosphate mine and how it impacts Nauru's finances pre and post independence. Fascinating stuff. We stand freedom for everybody, so congratulations to comrades there.
Yeah, and a glaring example of how imperialism and colonization does really exploit these places in a very blatant way in this case. Sometimes it's more subversive. This one was just they made a giant pit on the island, right, and released chemicals out into the population. Like we said, congratulations to Nauru. Now, back to the topic at hand. There's a key demographic that are typically on the front lines of these protests that we mentioned last week, the direct action, clashes with police. And it's a demographic that the weird COVID years definitely catapulted me and you out of, Adam, and that is the youth.
Well, thanks for that, yes. Maybe.
As I was reflecting on this episode, I was like, are we the youth? Not really anymore.
Not really, I guess. Maybe. Yes, the youth. When is the youth?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Before we start today, what ages do you largely define as quote-unquote the youth? And why would we dedicate a whole episode to them?
I think the second part of that question is easier than the first. We would dedicate an episode to the youth because they are so often at the forefront of revolutionary and protest movements. I think in part because the youth tend to have a lot of time on their hands and sort of fewer pure prospects, less to lose. And if you look at various revolutionary movements, protest movements throughout history, take the US, right? The Declaration of Independence, the founding fathers, a lot of them were like younger than 25, right?
Yeah, a lot of them were. Maybe we'll see something about that later.
Okay, I think that if I was defining youth for the purposes of talking about protests, I think it was probably moved down a little bit, made a little bit younger post sort of Greta Thunberg. So I might put the start at like 15, which I think was how old she was when she got started on the Skolstrejk för klimat, or however you say it in Swedish, and got up to, I don't know, maybe 30. I feel like we can sneak in there under the radar.
We can sneak in there.
There's that saying, like, don't trust anyone over 30. That's from an old protest movement. I can't remember which one.
I mean, there's a lot of videos going viral nowadays where they're on a night out, you know, in places like England or Amsterdam or America. And they ask the young people, how old is old for you? And they say anyone born in the 1900s.
Yeah, I hate the ones where it's like, how old is too old to go clubbing? And they're like 27. I'm like, cool, thanks, guys.
Yeah, I mean, for me, clubbing was too old at like 19, at least in the UK, because everyone's got the fake IDs. It just feels like a high school dance. But I think one point we can bring up is that there are different stages of life, largely. Not always, but many of the youth do go to university. Many of them don't have full-time jobs, especially in Europe. And then when they leave, many of them are in the full-time corporate workforce. And I think that there's a clear line there when we're talking about protest movements, in that the people before that stage may be considered youth regardless of maybe what age they are, but the people that are now the cogs into the corporate machine maybe have aged out of youth, and they have a different part to play in this equation.
I think that is broadly true. I don't know that it's so rigid as that. I think that these could be seen as trends that might broadly apply over swathes of society, but by no means capture sort of everyone who falls in or out of those age categories, because there are always mitigating factors. But broadly, I think that's right.
Okay. We're going to tackle this topic in a few key themes. First, we're going to look at how the youth's lack of stake in a capitalist system makes them bold, but also vulnerable. We'll tackle some theory. We always got to touch on it a little bit. And we'll look at why the young people are critical for revolutions. Then we'll close out with some examples of youth in radical movements, past and present.
Sounds good.
So, the revolutionary potential of youth. A lot of people see them as a prime target for radicalization. They see them as the frontliners. And a lot of this is down to just the characteristics of youth. One of them being their idealism. And before we dive in, often in history, we have seen that the youth are the first to take action in revolutionary movements. And why do you think this is, Adam?
Probably because, as we say, they have more time, they have less to lose. I think also there's an element of becoming aware of the world and how the world works that can be infuriating. When you're a child, you really don't know what's going on, right? Like, you rely on your parents for absolutely everything. If you're in a stable, loving home, then that is likely the case, that your parents will sort out all of the issues for you when you're really a child. Then as you get older, you start to encounter the world on your own terms, and that gradually becomes more and more as you get older. And so where we define youth for the purposes of this podcast is often the first instance that people will engage with the world as individuals navigating it in their own right. And I think that can feel like a lot of bullshit when it happens, right? You realize how broken a lot of things are, how injustices go on, etc. And I think certain people will realize this younger. I think the fewer advantages you have in society, the younger you are probably aware of the sort of bullshit nature of much of it. But I think it can inflame those passions in that way. And also the fact, I think, that the youth by and large have that sort of the impassioned energy, right? Your frontal lobe is not fully developed. You get angry.
It's sometimes hard to remember life before that frontal lobe was developed, and you just go, what was I thinking?
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I think there's also an element of the youth rebelling against the norms.
Yeah.
Young people, regardless of the society, tend to reject traditional structures and embrace some radical new alternative. And in the past, this has manifested in different ways. I mean, we're a leftist podcast. I don't know about your parents. My parents are not leftist.
They are... I suppose they're liberal.
Okay. Adam had the cool house everyone could go drink at. We get it. We get it.
We could drink in a bar from 16. We didn't need that.
All right. Swiss people are weird. Okay. Anyway, What I mean by that is that even this stance I have is countercultural, right, to the world that I grew up in. And some examples of this aren't just people going from like conservative to liberal and liberal to leftist, but it can go any way, really. In the Eastern Bloc, you had the youth stray more towards Western entertainment and culture, going from a socialist structure towards craving like neoliberalism at times. Adam mentioned the Prague Lenin Wall last episode as a big example of this. I mean, America's youth today, particularly white males, are trending in a conservative Christian direction, despite growing up with potentially more liberal parents that, elected Obama and lived under those ideals.
Yeah.
As you said as well, the youth have the least to lose, most to gain. So they don't have property, most of them, right? They don't have careers yet. They don't have family obligations. This usually is something that ties older generations to the status quo, even if they are unhappy with it. And increasingly, society has made this so in ways that retirements are tied to the stock market. So if the US government fails, for example, then all Americans fail. If we go down, you go down with us. But this most to gain also serves as kind of a critique of the youth. Marx's analysis of dispossession, like of reallocation of wealth, really appeals to someone that has nothing, right?
I suppose so, yeah.
So people that criticize Marxism will often just say, oh, well, wait till you have a house one day and then see how you like that idea.
This happened to me not too long ago where I was talking to some family friends about Amsterdam's squat scene and how squatting has a huge role in the history of Amsterdam, and many squats were legalized throughout the 70s and remain sort of legal squats to this day. If they're not occupied for a certain amount of time, people can legally squat there. And this has been sort of rolled back over the years, but a lot of these sort of more established ones are music venues now and community centres, and they collect food for homeless people, they put on punk concerts, etc. And I was saying this to some family friends, and she was like, they just moved in, they don't own it. I'm like, yeah, it's great. And she was like, let's see if you feel that way when you own a building. I'm like, if I owned a building that was empty and I was just sitting on it, and I got angry about some squatters moving in, I would be a radically different person than who I am today. I would not meaningfully be the same person that I am today if that were to happen.
This is why the US wants to ban TikTok, Adam. It's because people have lost their sympathy for the most important class, that being landlords, right?
Yeah, poor landlords.
Yeah, no one's ever looking out for them, But you're right. I think that's an interesting point. Another trait of the youth is that of what one might call their naivete, but could also be interpreted more as clarity, where the youth haven't been fully indoctrinated into the system of powers and are still idealistic and open to change. So the critics would call it being naive, but other people could say, well, they just see it, the bigger picture for what it is. American students historically have always leaned towards the side of sympathy, especially towards the victims of American imperialism, by and large. Not every American student, but these big motions have gone on in the past. We have Vietnam War protests, Iraq War, currently solidarity with Palestinians. What would you say to someone, Adam, who believes that sympathy and open-mindedness is naive or like, quote unquote, just a phase?
Well, first, in reference to student movements of years gone by, I remember a conversation with my granddad when I was telling him that I was going to a protest back when I was a student, and he said, in my day it was Cuba. Hands off Cuba. So you're right. It goes through the generations. The idea of it being just a phase, I think, is a bit of a red herring in these instances. I think it's often used as a tactic to discredit people on the basis of being young. And now, young people are often naive and can be. But I think that has more to do usually with how young people interact with the world on a sort of personal and interpersonal level, rather than seeing the sort of systems at play. I think that naivety certainly can come into how we see systems and how we see the world, but I do not think that is in any means bound to youth. I think that if you look at who believes sort of obvious lies about the way the world are, I don't think that is separated for the youth. And indeed, I think it these days often skews older, because I think younger people, although I'm not sure about Gen Alpha, maybe we've already lost this ability, but people our age are certainly more critical of the things we see online than older people, for example. Mm-hmm. Like, you see boomer memes, and it's all just AI images that they apparently cannot tell are clearly AI images.
Yeah.
Or accounts that are clearly bait. you know, rage bait. Take Brexit, for example. The idea that a bus was driving around saying £350 million that was going to Europe could be spent on the NHS instead. Lots of people believed that, and it was extremely naive, but that wasn't youth-linked.
To your point, some of the largest icons in socialist politics in the West today are two very old men. In the UK, it's Jeremy Corbyn, and in the US is Bernie Sanders. And I think they're admired by the youth because of their persistence and their willingness to still listen to the youth and to always learn and to stand by their convictions through all these years. And it's inspiring a lot of young people to get into politics, me included. Maybe not the getting into politics part yet.
Well, you can be into politics without being a politician, right?
True. But I am who I am now, in part due to the man I'm talking to now, Mr. Adam being in my ear all those years.
Stop it, you.
But then also, you know, I attended a Bernie Sanders rally when I was 19.
Right.
You know, before that frontal lobe was established. And, you know, thankfully I attended one of his rallies and not a Trump rally when I was very impressionable. But those messages still stuck with me, and I carry them today.
Yeah, I mean, I was about that age when Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party in the UK. I turned 18, and so I was able to vote for him for Labour leader. And I do think you're right, there's something about the persistence of values over time. But I also think, I don't know so much about Sanders in the US, but Corbyn certainly managed to also earn the admiration of some very popular figures, especially among the youth. But for example, he appeared on stage at Glastonbury with Stormzy.
Yeah.
Right? Like, Stormzy was like, big up Jeremy Corbyn, which I'm sure didn't hurt amongst the youth.
I mean, which, if you listen to Stormzy, every single song is calling out some conservative politician.
Yeah.
To the point where you have to, at times, look up who they are. It's like, all right, he's going for the foreign secretary.
Yeah, no one's safe.
But I think maybe there's another point as well in the older generations seeing the youth as naive and calling it a phase. Maybe there's a guilt with some of them. Think of the boomers that were the hippies back in the very idyllic 60s and what they imagined the world to be, and then they just became corporate accountants or whatever. No offense, I know there are corporate accountants that want to listen to this podcast. Shout out to you, Jonathan. But it was a far stretch from the world that they imagined when they were younger. And I think maybe they see the youth and their idealism with a bit of disdain and a little bit of self-hatred in that way. Or maybe I'm reaching. What do you think?
I can see that. Disdain might not be the word that I use. That could be a part of it, but it could also be the sense of you have to think the youth are naive, because if you don't think they are naive, that makes you a monster. So it's part of the mental gymnastics that are involved in that.
100%. That's true. We've been talking about this point for a while, but the youth are often rash. They're passionate. Mm-hmm. And this can be a good thing. This can be a bad thing. Many key figures, as you mentioned, in the American Revolution were very young at the time. In 1776, when it started, Alexander Hamilton was 21. Marquis de Lafayette, who played a very big role in like the actual battles and the negotiation with France, he was 18.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and it would put him in his 30s during the French Revolution, where he played an even bigger role too. Somehow managed to not get his head cut off too.
Yeah.
James Madison was 25. And even the older ones weren't that old. Thomas Jefferson was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. George Washington, who was older than them all, basically, other than Ben Franklin, was 44. Right. So this was very much a youth movement in America, and the energy was a big component of how they wore down the British. But this energy can often lead to a misguided passion at times. Adam, have you ever heard of Louis-Antoine Saint-Just? I don't know how to pronounce that, but AKA the Archangel of Terror in the French Revolution.
I believe he was one sentence in my history textbook when I was doing the IB. So kind of, but not really.
Well, that's one more sentence than appears in the American textbook. So. How would you pronounce that name, by the way?
Louis-Antoine Saint-Just.
Thank you, man who lived in Switzerland. I didn't really know much about him until learning more about the French Revolution in my master's program. But he was Robespierre's right-hand man, Robespierre being, the one leading the reign of terror, chopping everyone's heads off. And this Archangel of Terror, as he was known, often spoke for Robespierre in the National Assembly. He was known for his unshakable conviction and his ideals to the revolution. No one was safe in his eyes if they were breaking these ideals. And being the one that spoke for Robespierre, He was the public face of France's reign of terror. Many, many executions were announced and led by him, but in 1794, he was himself guillotined alongside his friend Robespierre after serving in his position for over 2 years. Now, Adam, can you take a guess at how old the Archangel of Terror was at the time of his execution?
I probably shouldn't because I just glanced at your notes and saw it immediately.
All right, well, he was 26.
Yeah, younger than both of us.
Younger than both of us, and he took up his first posting in the National Assembly when he was, I think, 20.
Wow.
Crazy life. And I don't bring him up as an example of the folly of youth, but I do bring him up as a cautionary tale as to how the passion of youth can sometimes lead us into conviction for beliefs that we may not fully understand the consequences of. What do you think of this, Adam? Can you think of a time when youthful zeal for a movement both helped and hurt its progress?
Well, I mentioned it already at the beginning of the podcast, unintentionally, but the school strike that started in Sweden, I think, is an example of this. And you've seen various youth strikes for climate since then. And I think initially that helped it gain a lot of attention. It was this little girl who was sat outside of her school once a week, who built up this movement and had a lot of kids and young people really inspired by it who also left school. And that meant that some people in positions of power really elevated her. Look at this girl who is a leader. And of course it helps that she's a young white girl. There are indigenous and non-white activists who have been doing similar work who get less recognition. Vanessa Nakate, for example. But Greta Thunberg, spoke at Davos and spoke all around the world and was similarly dismissed by sort of right-wing figures, many of whom were utterly disgusting towards her if you look at some of the comments that were made back when she was a child. So there was the benefit of getting more visibility through that, but also then being easier to dismiss. I think it's interesting now that Greta has taken a much more sort of leftist anti-colonial approach to the climate and really shown up for Palestine, that the big powerful politicians don't want to platform her anymore. They don't want to bring her out in front of Davos now that she's like, actually, it's all your fault.
Well, the irony of her going to Davos in the first place.
Well, yeah. Maybe that was the naivety, right?
Yeah, she's a very clear example of, like, that original naivety, I think, no offense to her.
And by naivety in the sense that, like, believing these institutions that cause these problems were also the means to solve it directly. Like, you just have to ask nicely and they'll do it.
Right. Even her understanding of climate change in general, right? I think you spoke before a few episodes ago about the polar bears and turning off the lights.
Right. Yeah.
That might have been even before this preseason. But anyway, Adam used to turn off all the lights in his house and sit in the dark to save the polar bears as a kid.
I did when I was about 8, yeah.
And it really did kind of come across in this very like neoliberal sense of climate protest at first, because obviously she was like 15. But then you could see the education start and she learns more about the world and she realizes, oh, capitalism is causing all this. Imperialism is causing all this. We need to go for those structures. As soon as she does that, the CNNs of the world, the BBC, they start to discredit her, stop covering her at all at times, and that's because she realized the source of this rather than just, I think it is quite a neoliberal way to protest just by saying what's wrong, just pointing at a problem that is a symptom and not looking at the cause. Let's move on to a little bit of theory. As we referred to it in the last episode, the ideas of dead white men. Being a leftist podcast, these men either have to be bald or they have to have glorious facial hair.
True.
That's the rules. We didn't make the rules. Those just are the rules. Before we jump into some light theory, can you please read this quote from a dead white man that was both bald and had great facial hair, Vladimir Lenin?
Give me just one generation of youth and I'll transform the whole world.
So like many Lenin quotes, this one is credited to be said by him all over the place, but I couldn't find an actual source. Sure. But the sentiment remains. Now, as he says there, give me one generation of youth. That's all he needs. The youth are huge in Marxist thought and Leninist thought and all the contemporaries afterwards, really. And why does it matter to Marx? I mean, youth is a break from tradition, right? His whole ideas are based on overturning an old system and the youth are less invested in maintaining this status quo, so they could serve as the most open ears to this message. Now, Lenin, who was the leader of the Russian Revolution and is a later figure than Marx, took his work and revised it a bit to shape it to the Russian situation. He wanted to focus a lot on education and revolutionary consciousness in the youth, and this was especially after the Soviet Union was established because it was a successful revolution. So how do we maintain this? They saw it as an eternal revolution, not just one that was one and done.
Could you elaborate a bit on what you mean by eternal revolution?
What Lenin saw the Soviet Union as was the vanguard, which we'll talk about in a second, but that frontline leader in global socialist revolution. He didn't just see it as the chance to liberate people of the Russian Empire from capitalism, but he saw it as a bastion of socialism that they could then use to inspire other subjected people to lead their own revolutions.
That was definitely a part of Lenin's ideology and mission. What I understand from Eternal Revolution, and I'm sure we'll go into this more as we go, and we can maybe both learn a bit more about it, but my understanding of it is that Eternal Revolution means that you don't reach an end point per se. You are always sort of assessing, reflecting on the society as it stands and the sort of laws and structures that are in place and progressing beyond them where necessary.
Yes, I think that's true as well. And I think that was a big difference between Lenin and then Stalin, who came after him, whereas Lenin was very open to critique of how can this society be made better, whereas Stalin would have no critique, as we know very famously, about him as a person or as him as a leader of a nation. So I mentioned it just now, the vanguard. This is probably the most important part of Lenin's view towards the youth. He saw the youth as the vanguard of revolution, bridging theory with the action. The vanguard is essentially defined as those on the front lines, whether that be in political action or in direct action in other means. In the Russian Revolution, there were literally foot soldiers. But the name vanguard derives from the word used in ancient Rome in the military structure. In their legions, the vanguard was the unit that was the front and center of battle. It was seen as an honor to be part of the vanguard. Those were the bravest and most accomplished soldiers. An example of the vanguard in my life was when I was in Hong Kong in 2019. I spoke about that last episode a bit, but the vanguard in that example could be seen as the frontline protesters, those that were actually combating the police. There were many youth that had umbrellas and gas masks and would throw the tear gas back at the police, but it could also be seen as the politicians who are fighting legislatively on behalf of the people of Hong Kong against the CCP. Now, Adam, do you think that Lenin's faith in youth as the vanguard still holds up in modern revolutionary movements, or is it an antiquated thought?
I actually don't think that it holds up. I think that it could do. But when we talk about the vanguard, I think there are two different things that are going on. I think there is saying the vanguard in the sense of these are the people who are at the forefront of the protest. They're talking the talk. They're occupying the buildings. They're, chucking gas canisters back at the police, whatever, like in Hong Kong. In that case, yes, the vanguard there is this sort of youth movement. And you often do see that throughout contemporary protest movements. But from what I understand it, and again, I'm not a scholar on Lenin, but from what I understand, when he was talking about the vanguard, he was talking about a professional unit, a highly regimented, strictly disciplined unit, ideally paid professionals who will sort of work full-time being revolutionaries so that it can be properly organized and brought into effect. I have just read, and I don't know if you have finished or are still reading, but we have been reading a book called If We Burn by Vincent Bevin, which is about protest movements over the past decade or so, and he points out that although, yes, the youth are ideally at the helm of protests, mass protest movements that have happened over the past decade, they have often lacked any sort of centralizing structure. Deliberately so. They have deliberately been horizontal movements trying to bring equality of action and thought to the people there, the idea that everything can be democratically decided there and then at protest movement, which I think is a noble idea and one that I was rather inclined to, but this book has sort of convinced me is not the most effective strategy if you're trying to bring about structural change, and you need some sort of form of centralization, some sort of direction if you're going to have this movement. And then vanguard in the Leninist sense of having this highly disciplined, organized central unit, just as opposed to who is at the forefront, is an important distinction.
And I think Lenin himself saw himself as being part of that vanguard as well. These are theories. They have their critiques. They have their challenges. One of those being that we may over-romanticize romanticize the youth in protest, in revolution. So there are instances where youthful inexperience has led to failures. When we look at like the Occupy movement, that was a lot of young people that were inexperienced and maybe unready for the violent nature of the police removal of them. Adam, is there a risk in relying too heavily on the youth for revolutionary action?
I think there's a risk in relying on anyone for revolutionary action. The youth as a category, I'm not sure there's more of a risk than any other sort of distinct category. I suppose that the risk that comes to mind when talking about the youth and any potential pitfalls there is to do with sort of the fickleness of their attachment, right? Like maybe they're interested in something else the next day, but then perhaps that's unfair. Perhaps that's part of this sort of hegemonic understanding of youth calling for change, that their interests will be somewhere else the next day. I don't know if that actually holds up to scrutiny. I think there are young people who are dedicated to a cause over the long term. It's just that if you're dedicated to a cause over the long term, at some point you stop being the youth.
Right, like us.
Like us. Maybe that's the danger. You age out of it. You're not in that category long enough to make meaningful enough change.
I think as we mentioned last episode, you got to know your role in a protest for it to be effective. So maybe it's learning how your role can evolve. Personally looking at it, not pointing at anyone in this call necessarily, but maybe going from getting hospitalized by a riot police officer to maybe taking that step of local organizing and being a local leader in their parties that align with them, even if they themselves feel that they don't want the spotlight.
That would be great advice for somebody not on this podcast, I'm sure.
Stay tuned for Adam's MP run in 20 years.
Then I will have well and truly aged out of the youth. 48 is not youthful by any stretch of the imagination.
Bernie Sanders is still balling at 83. He does a youth basketball league, and he's out there.
No way. Moves. That's so cool.
You mentioned earlier that there may be tension between that youthful radicalism and that structured leadership. There might be a need for it, but the youth don't want to hear that part of it. They want to keep it decentralized. They want to keep it informal. But another critique may be vulnerability to that malleability that the youth have. As we said, the youth are highly impressionable. That makes them ideal targets for revolutionary education and propaganda. But as we've seen, and as I mentioned at the top, it's not just progressive thought that can get into the minds of the youth, as we're seeing in America today with the youth trending towards the right. You know, the positive of this mindset is that the youth can adopt radical ideas quickly, but the negative is that they're also vulnerable to manipulation. So how do we balance the need to engage youth in revolution while avoiding their exploitation by opportunists?
It's a good question. I think that education is really at the base of all of this. The younger you can start to educate people about these issues, the more sort of informed they can be. But not only about the issues themselves, I think that is what is really important to teach kids in particular, even before the youth, is critical thinking and media literacy skills. I believe and have believed for a long time that philosophy should be like from kindergarten taught, right? I think it should be one of like the core, like math, English, philosophy, I think should really be there, because I think that it helps you to learn how to interrogate texts, interrogate messaging, teaches you how to think about things. And alongside that, if we want the youth to be effective in revolutionary movements, we need to find organizations that have space for the youth to learn, ways for them to get involved. I also think there's a charm to kids getting involved in sort of groups at school. Like there was an Amnesty International club at my school, for example, which isn't exactly a protest group, but they did protests.
You're giving away how posh your school was.
Yeah, as I was saying it, there's something good about seeing like kids figure it out in these sort of low stakes environments on their own. But I think there needs to be some sort of bridge made beyond that to help young people develop these skills, particularly around sort of oration and debate and public speaking. Before Christmas, I went to a documentary screening in a cinema not far from where I live called Criterion. There's a really cool like independent cinema scene in Amsterdam. There's tons of independent cinemas. They do all sorts of events. And this is one that is directly opposite the university. So a lot of student groups put on films there and then do a talk about it. And this was a Palestine documentary filmed in 2022. And afterwards there was a talk from this Middle East scholar and this activist. And the Middle East scholar, he was great. He had some really interesting thoughts on all of it. The activist, she was clearly very passionate and had organized a lot in the student protests at the University of Amsterdam, and so had this sort of position of leadership authority. But she was also like 21, 22, and when people asked questions, it was clear that she didn't quite have the sort of framework to deal with those questions. She was nearly like, she had something there, but she didn't quite have the sort of skills to articulate her thoughts in the way that I think she wanted to, and I think that was apparent from how she was talking about it. I think other people there would have felt the same as me on that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that in terms of engaging the youth, we need to think longer term about it, right? Like building these structures that help young people to find ways to protest in low stakes environment. If you have kids or young cousins, take them to marches, for example, big marches, and they can see all of that stuff. Teach these frameworks for how to think about things, how to speak, how to debate, all of that. I think it's a big project to ensure that young people are able to participate without being made into stooges. Because exploitation goes both ways, right? It goes from the people pushing the revolution, getting people to do grunt work and the sort of cheap labor that is always demanded of the youth. And then there's the other side where you see videos on YouTube of like, Ben Shapiro annihilates liberal, and it's just some college kid who asked him a question.
Yeah, no, those are good points. I think the Soviet Union had a lot of programs like that. They had a lot of youth organizations that were spearheaded by Lenin in the first place, and they were kind of doing a lot of those things. At the same time, when we're talking about youth programs and getting people politically indoctrinated, potentially young, there's a danger to it. One example you can look at is the Hitler Youth. Right? That was taking ideas that are horrifying and normalizing them and training the young to buy into them. In America today, it's very hard to find a robust system of extracurriculars other than sports due to the nature of American sports in general and all the money in it. That's where all the energy goes for the young people. And it's really sad to see when you travel abroad and you see how well-rounded other young people are becoming, even without some of those programs that you're talking about. The youth definitely does need some sort of education and structure into contextualizing their ideas, orating their ideas. Part of that might be that in some of these protests, there is a hunger for power amongst some people, and they're just unwilling to lift others up. They want to be the person that has all the answers. They don't want to equip other people with the skills to then potentially replace them. But I think that's the sign of a very toxic movement. We can move on to our closing segment here, and that's historic and modern examples of youth in protest. I'm going to keep it pretty brief. We will touch on these for sure in their own episodes one day, maybe more than once, but I wanted to choose two examples from one era in the past where the youth demonstrated a huge impact. One of those being Paris, 1968. This was 1 month of student-led protests, May 1968, occupying universities and factories. The government feared a full-scale revolution. It was this very, very explosive time in France. They were protesting against capitalism, consumerism, aiding American imperialism abroad because the Vietnam War was the U.S. taking up that posting from France. And just the traditional institutions as a whole, where the youth saw a lack of opportunity for themselves, a lack of a place in that society. Battles in the streets erupted between police and protesters to the point where President Charles de Gaulle fled the country for West Germany. The irony in de Gaulle fleeing to Germany, right?
Yeah.
If you know, he was the leader of the French resistance during the Nazi occupation in the 40s. And a snap election was called. So you have this hero of revolution in one sense in Charles de Gaulle, who led the French resistance. He's this icon of World War II. And his legacy, ultimately, other than an airport named after him, is...
Terrible airport.
Yeah.
The second worst airport I know after LAX.
But de Gaulle's lasting legacy is essentially his failure as a president. Kind of like Winston Churchill post-war. Sometimes you have leaders that are very good during a war situation who then struggle to lead at home. And de Gaulle failed the youth in this sense. Now, on the other side of the Atlantic, American students were also leading a movement, and that was protesting against the said Vietnam War. This had a global impact to the point where even the leader of the North Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh, recognized them as an example of how Americans do know right from wrong, and they know it's unjust. Listen to your youth in this situation. They were opposing the draft because when there's military draft, it's the young people that go, not the old people. And this was a war that they ultimately didn't feel they had a say in. They were opposing the imperialist action of the U.S. government. One big example of fiery clash during these protests was the Kent State shooting in 1970. This was at a university in Ohio. This is where several students were killed point blank by the U.S. military, the National Guard, that was sent to disperse the protests, and this led to even more intense student protests around the country. You'd see graffiti around college campuses saying they can't kill us all. And these widespread protests, combined with the Pentagon Papers of 1971, I believe, were what ultimately led to the pressure mounting for the U.S. to eventually withdraw from Vietnam. So I brought those two up, one, because they're the same era, but also because it shows that in this day and age where a lot of youth movements are not successful, it is possible. It is possible for student movements and young people movements to succeed. Now, there are contemporary examples as well. The Arab Spring in 2011, this was the youth leveraging apps like Facebook to organize across the Middle East and protest their leadership, because most didn't have democratic power, and some were successful, some were not. Tunisia is seen as a bit more successful than some of the other ones. Egypt's government was toppled, but kind of replaced by an even more authoritarian one, but a very impactful youth movement nonetheless. You have climate protests. I mean, Adam mentioned Greta Thunberg, but also Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil. Now, Adam, you've been to quite a few climate protests in your day. Mm-hmm. What are the typical demographics at these events, just out of curiosity?
So I've been to climate protests in London, in Zurich, and in Amsterdam. So European cities. I've lived in all of these cities, so that's not me traveling to go to protests. Pretty white, usually, and fairly young. I mean, none of that is exclusively. The Extinction Rebellion protests in London, when we occupied Marble Arch, was a more diverse group, but even so, I would say bulk white, young. Actually, there was a big range of people in ages, but middle class, I think, primarily. Okay. Middle class more than anything else.
And the age, you said, varied.
Yeah, I think that one in particular, it was quite varied. I think other ones have been younger. But that specific one was quite mixed.
I asked because when you see climate protesters typically getting arrested for blocking highways or protesting outside of oil refineries or something, it usually, at least the images they share, is really young people.
Yeah.
So that's why I wanted to ask.
I think the more radical arms are more inclined to be young, for sure.
Okay. And Palestinian youth resistance. So this is a huge gap between the older generations and the younger generations in the West. Usually the older generations who are used to the status quo are very used to their governments supporting and arming Israel. The young people nowadays, with social media, being able to see the bombs falling, ask why. And I mean, I've mentioned some examples here. What patterns do you see in youth-led movements across history, Adam?
I think it's quite common to see these being student-led. And I think that whilst that is in part the fact that students just have more time on their hands and less to lose and more to gain, I also think there's something about the fact that you are coming together to a university as an institution for a couple of reasons. I mean, it's a bit of a meme on the left and right for different reasons that college radicalizes your kid, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is that you meet people from all over the world with all different backgrounds. And if not all over the world, then maybe all walks of life, right? Could be your city, or could be your state or your country, or maybe all over the world. And people are going to bring different ideas and experiences that you maybe didn't get at your high school, because you tend to go to the high school that was closest to your house. Some people go to the university closest to their house, but I think people tend to travel more for university than for school. And the ideas you study, I think, are also going to be new ideas, right? Like, there's quite a limited range of things that you learn in high school. You sort of start to question things, but for me, really, when I got to university, that was when I started to realize not only the flaws in the systems that we had, more so than I had when I was younger than that, but also that the systems did not have to be this way, and indeed have and are different throughout time and place. For example, I did a module in my undergrad called the Anthropology of Capitalisms. And lecture one, they sort of stood up and said, now, listen, we're not just going to be bashing capitalism here. We're going to examine the different forms that it's taken throughout the world in different cultures and see what we can compare and contrast between these. Now, it very much was a course just bashing capitalism, but there were also many different forms that this sort of institution takes and continues to take throughout the world. And things like that where you realize, oh, these systems were created by people and could just as easily be created in a different way. That's a very powerful idea when you learn that for the first time. And I think people encounter it in different ways.
Mm-hmm. I think people that critique university as a brainwashing system that is turning their kids liberal, they operate under a system where unfettered information, especially scholarly information, is a radicalizing force on their kids. And if that's the case, then it's time to examine the system in which you live. Because if you require censorship in order for your children to believe what you believe, then there's a problem there.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of these more left-leaning politicians, as we mentioned, Corbyn, Sanders, none of them advocate for any sort of censorship in universities. They just want the youth to learn, right?
Yeah.
Because the more people know, the more likely they are to actually end up on their side. Whereas the less people know, maybe the more conservative and reactionary they will tend to be. Let's look at these lessons that we can learn from the youth and conclude. Now, what do the youth bring to revolution? We've talked about it: energy, creativity, fearlessness in the face of authority. There are many, many examples of this fearlessness. And one of my favorite videos on the whole internet is from the 2019 Hong Kong protests. Someone's filming out of the window of a bus as the protests are going on, and there's a big clash with the police and the protesters, and a lot of them are fleeing the riot police that charged. And a kid that was no older than 16 or 17 was being dragged away by the arm by a police officer in full riot gear. The officer also had his phone. The kid's friend was holding him by the waist, trying to pull him out of the grasp of the officer, when out of nowhere, out of frame, another protester of the same age flies in and kicks the policeman in the head.
I've seen this video.
Yeah. And the two other protesters get up, and the friend hits the policeman with his umbrella until he lets go of the other guy's phone, and then all three get away.
Amazing stuff.
I mean, if nothing exemplifies the fearlessness of the youth more than that video. Now, that being said, do you think that this fearlessness of the youth is more of an asset or a liability to a wider movement? Because there were a lot of people in Hong Kong that condemned those type of actions that were on the protester side.
I think that this is where we've got to go, and you may not be expecting this direction that I'm going to go, but to Plato. I think Plato could be Aristotle or Socrates. I get them all mixed up. The idea of the golden mean, right? That any quality is a virtue or a vice in different quantities. Passion is positive until it becomes anger, or it's about having the balance. And I think that fearlessness is a perfect example of that, because if you take fearlessness to either extreme, if you have absolute fear, you're never going to do anything because you're too afraid to leave your house. Anything could hurt you. But if you have no fear, then you'll jump off a building because you're not worried about getting hurt. I mean, that's a ridiculous example, but you get the point.
Well, you say that. I don't think any of these YouTubers in Russia are 45 years old that are scaling the Burj Khalifa.
That is the craziest genre of content, and I feel afraid just watching it. But I suppose case in point, right? And so I think fearlessness is a good thing when applied strategically. I think that if you know the instances in which to harness that fearlessness and you are able to do so, then that can be a very, very powerful tool. But I also think that it can be damaging. I also think it's important to bear in mind that at any protest, someone's gonna say something dumb. Like, I was at a Palestine protest not that long ago, a lot of police about, and there was a guy standing near me who was like, "We should burn down a police station." I'm like, no. No, let's not do that.
I like your gusto, kid, but
calm down. Calm down. Let's just chill out a little bit here.
Listen here, Sonny.
Yeah.
That's your line now. You're not the youth, Adam. But yeah, I mean, that does actually bring up my last point, which is that violence against protesters is so much more common against the youth than otherwise. In fact, in some protest movements, there is a point to send out the old people to kind of lower the tension, because the police officers are less likely to attack some old ladies.
Right.
That happened in Hong Kong as well. After some really violent clashes, the organizers and other groups were like, no, how about the Rotary Club goes and does this one to show the police, hey, attack us. And they never did. Yeah, the risk of a youth movement is that the state tends to weaponize violence against these young protesters at a much higher rate. And as you've said a few episodes now, the state holds the monopoly on violence. So it should not come as a surprise when the establishment doesn't see the youth as one of them and is more willing to accept them as casualties. I already mentioned Kent State in the Vietnam War protests, but Tiananmen Square in China in 1989, we don't know the exact number, but thousands of student protesters were killed by the Chinese military. I mean, the accounts of the reporters that were there are like horrifying. But the Arab Spring, as we mentioned, I strategically didn't mention Syria before, but either end of 2011 or beginning of 2012, that was when the Assad regime deployed chemical weapons against student protesters. And what do you do at that point, right? If you have been peacefully protesting and then you get hit with mustard gas, you have no choice but to be violent or to die.
Yeah.
So that led to the Syrian civil war, which lasted for 12 years after that.
At a slightly less intense level, I mean, tear gas is a chemical weapon.
Yeah, that's true. And tear gas is definitely more likely to be used against a young person than an old person, for sure. There were lawyer protests as well in Hong Kong. Those never had the tear gas shot at them. But knowing this violence that is more likely to occur, what do modern youth movements need to learn from their historical predecessors in order to succeed?
Modern youth movements would, in my opinion, really benefit from bearing in mind the role of discipline and discipline around certain centralized issues, right? Specific protest movements are going to have more success if they have very clear goals and are loud about those goals, right? It's easy for a media organization, a dominant source, to say, oh, they're just causing trouble, they don't want anything. They may have clearly outlined goals that are just not being talked about because that's not the most visible element of it. Shouting about them, organizing around them, and having discipline within the ranks, I think is important. Now, that's not to say give power over to a dictator, but I think when you are organizing a protest, when protests are being organized, the delegation of certain roles to certain groups, certain individuals with a sort of strategic alignment, I think is really important and can make your movement much more effective.
Good points. Now, I have a final question for you, and you've kind of answered a little bit there, but I'd like you to expand on it. How can movements ensure that the passion of the youth translates into lasting systematic change? And where do the old guys, where does the older generation fit into this?
I think that my answer to this is similar to my answer to most questions in terms of sort of leftist strategy building, which is to be sort of community minded and focused, right? Community means, especially in the wake of the election of Donald Trump in November. He's the president now. Fun. Just seeing the time. Congratulations to my comrades across the Atlantic. After his election, a lot of sort of stuff went around on social media about resisting this, forming sort of mutual aid networks, etc. And at the very base level, that involves getting to know your neighbors, right? Like, learn your neighbors' names, which I think is really a great starting point for that. And building these movements that ideally operate at first within a specific community at a local level, bringing in as many different kinds of people as you can, so that you are presenting this sort of diversified front. Like, there is not one specific group or demographic that is responsible for bearing the weight of all of this, and that knowledge and wisdom and energy can be shared amongst a group. The other side of it, I think, is building in systems that make it sustainable, right? I think it's all well and good to organize around a specific issue that's the issue of the moment that you feel passionate about, but I think that sustaining that requires more than passion. Passion tends to fade over time. It's about systematizing things and building these what seem like somewhat boring structures maybe, but that are actually really important for keeping things going.
Yeah, and running on passion alone will burn you out. For sure.
This is the origin of the term self-care. It's been bastardized now in terms of thinking it's about like doing your skincare routine and whatever. But originally it comes from protest movements and I think civil rights advocates saying that using the term self-care to mean make sure you are doing the work to ensure that you don't burn out so that you have the energy to do this community work.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So we've covered the youth pretty well today. Any final thoughts before we close out, Adam?
There was a clip from the Bill Maher show.
Oh, God.
Not that long ago. I know, last year sometime. I'll bring it back, don't worry. On which the guest was Bill Burr.
Okay.
And Bill Maher was asking Bill Burr what he thought about these student Palestine protests. And Maher was trying to pull something of how they're all anti-Semitic, etc., etc. And Bill Burr clearly wasn't like quite equipped to have that conversation. He clearly didn't have like a ton of information about it.
Mm-hmm.
But his point was just, man, I'm with the kids. You look throughout history, you look at what the kids have been in favor of, that's almost always the right way to go. I'm with the kids. And I think adopting that attitude, taking young people seriously, and generally being supportive of what the youth are, or at least entertaining the ideas on their own terms and in a serious way, is a very powerful thing.
Well put. And I think that answers the question we have for ourselves and people older than us of what's our role in this. And it is taking their concerns seriously. That the youth are just as powerful a section of society as anyone, and when empowered properly, can institute some lasting changes.
I have one more thought before we move on to the final conclusion, which is, I am not old. Stop saying that I'm old throughout this podcast. I'm an unmarried man. Maybe that's it. Maybe marriage ages me, but I am not old.
Hey, denial's a powerful drug.
Yeah, right.
I embrace it. I think it's a good thing.
Let me hit 30. Let me hit 30 before I'm old.
I crave wisdom, not vigor.
Anyway.
As always, Adam, thank you for sharing your perspective as a youth with me, an old guy. You know, that 9-month age difference is a
full
is
9 months young.
doozy.
It's very important. I'm Gen Z.
Yeah, your back starts to hurt halfway through 28, just letting you know.
Good to know.
And thank you, dear listener, for coming along for the ride. I hope we've all learned something today. Tune in next week when Adam explains to us the other side of the equation. I'm really excited for this one, and that's the tools of oppression.
I apologize in advance. We are going to be talking about Foucault, and I'm sorry to subject you to that.
We look forward to it. Until then, look after each other and keep fighting the good fight. Adam, can you close us out with a quote from His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, from his book, Beyond Religion?
It is now down to the youth of today to make a better world than the one which has been bequeathed to them. Much rests upon their shoulders.